Today I'm adding splatter in a controlled way without the mess. Hello there, Michelle Short here with Terrific Tags with Michelle. I'm here on the Altenew YouTube channel on the first and third Saturday of the month. So if you enjoy my videos, I'd love for you to subscribe. So let's get started. I'm starting off with my focal point and I'm using the Cornered Blooms Outline stamp set. This stamp set is perfect for adding images into corners, as the name would suggest, but for today I thought I would use it in a different way. So I have placed my stamp onto some Classic Crest 110 solar white cardstock inside of my stamp wheel. I can pick up that stamp using the top flip plate and then ink up my stamp using Obsidian pigment ink. This is a tiny little image, but it is very detailed, so I want to make sure that I ink it up really well with that ink. I can then flip over that plate and stamp it down onto the cardstock. And with the stamp wheel, I like to get the bottom two corners in first and then work out the top corners afterwards. So just pressing that down to transfer that ink onto the cardstock, and I got a pretty good impression first time, but I do just want to make sure that those black lines are really nice and dark and black. So I am going to ink it up for a second time and stamp that down. I do apologise if my voice sounds a little bit odd. I am recovering from flu, so like I say, I apologise for that, but hopefully it's not too bad. So I'm going to set this aside to dry for a couple of minutes and then I can cut it out into a tag. So I'm using the Best Wishes Tags die set. So I can grab the tag that I want and also the hole reinforcers as well. I can line up my tag so that my image is on the left hand side of this tag. I did something very similar recently with an eclipse tag and I thought it looked really pretty, so I thought I would do the same thing today. And since these images are really quite small, I'm using a smaller tag. So I can just line that up where I want it to be and I can hold it down with some low tack tape. I think this is a great way to utilise those corner images in a different way. I can then die cut those hole reinforcers as well from the same cardstock. So I've run that through my die cutting machine and I only need one of those little hole reinforcers, but it does cut two at the same time, which is really helpful. I can place my tag onto my sticky mat. That's going to hold it in place while I do some ink blending on top. I'm using the Cherry Blossom Fresh Dye Ink collection today, and I'm starting off with the lightest shade, which is Pink Diamond, and I'm using a small blending brush. I'm going to come in from the left hand side of the tag. I'm going to focus the colour mainly on that left hand side where that image is, but I'm going to bring the ink a little bit further towards the right hand side so that I do cover some of that white tag. I was thinking that maybe I would colour in this image with alcohol markers, but I knew that I wouldn't end up with that much colour on the card because I'm just adding it to a white card base. So I thought this was quite nice to add that little bit of ink blending. Gives me a little bit more colour onto this tag. I can now move on to the second lightest shade, which is Pinkalicious. And again, just focusing that colour on the left hand side. I'm not bringing that ink as far across to the right hand side as I did with the lightest shade. And then these inks do tend to dry a little bit lighter than when they first go on. So I'm just adding a little bit extra darkness on that left hand side with the Razzleberry. And I'm using a mini blending brush for that so that I don't add too much of that ink. It is a little bit splotchy at this point, but as it dries, it does tend to smooth out. I can now add some glue onto the back of the hole reinforcer piece, and I can pop that at the top of the tag. I can then grab some twine. I'm going to fold it in half and then pop that through the hole of the tag. And then I can secure that at the front. And then I'm going to tie that in a bow. And I do tend to start off with a larger bow than I need and make it a little bit smaller. This tag is really quite small actually, so I don't need the bow to be too big. But I do tend to favour slightly bigger bows. So once I'm happy with the size of that, I can cut those tails down with some scissors. I can then add some instant dimension foam tape onto the back of the tag. So I'm just cutting some pieces of that. In hindsight, I should have used the thicker width of the foam tape. I didn't think of it at the time. So I am just going to cut some smaller pieces of this. I want to make sure that this tag is completely well supported at the back. So I am trying to cover as much of it as possible with that foam tape. So I can just finish off with some smaller pieces here where that hole is. But I don't want to cover that hole in case you can see the foam tape through it. I can then remove the backings off of that foam tape, and then I can adhere the tag down to an A2 size white card base. So that's a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. I'm just going to place it down really lightly to start with. Want to make sure it's straight before I press that down. I have then stamped and heat embossed a sentiment from the Cornered Blooms stamp set onto some Crafty Necessities jet black cardstock. I've cut that in a strip and adhered that down with some instant dimension foam tape. So I can now move on to my faux splatter. I'm taking the new fine liner pens. This is a set of 4 pens which are pigment ink based pens. There are 4 different sizes in the set. 005, 01, 03 and 05. I'm using the 3 smaller nibbed ones today. So I'm not using that 05, which is the largest. Now it's very difficult when creating your own faux splatter to try and make it random. I was worried going in directly with the pens that I may end up getting the kind of splatter pieces in the wrong place. So I'm going in with a pencil here and I'm just marking where I think I want them to be. If I change my mind, I can easily erase this out, but I obviously can't do that with the pens. So some of the pieces I'm going to have bigger than other pieces, but I'm trying to not add too much of this pencil down. It's okay when it's on the cardstock, like the white of the cardstock, but when it overlaps the ink blending, it's going to be really difficult to erase that out. So I'm just being careful here to be quite light-handed with this pencil. I want the splatter to kind of go in a bit of a diagonal on like where it would be behind this tag. That is what I would do if I was using paint to splatter. But this is a great way to add that splatter without the mess excuse me, without the mess of having to clear up the paint, and is a little bit more controlled as well. So you can definitely add as little or as much of this kind of faux splatter as you want. I am going more on the conservative side. I'm not adding a huge amount, but I obviously want to make sure that I've got enough of an impact that it looks intentional and I didn't just accidentally drop a pen on my card. So like I said, I'm being really light-handed here where I want the splatter to be on the actual tag itself. I'm going to start off with the larger kind of splatter pieces, and I'm using the 03 pen for this. I wanted some of them to look a little bit like they were behind the tags, kind of like coming from behind. Like I say, that's what I would do if I was using the paint, and then I would adhere the tag on top. So I can go in with these larger pieces here. I am trying to sort of do them in a round dot shape, but if you've ever splattered paint before, you will know that they don't end up being perfectly round a lot of the time. So I'm not too concerned if I don't get them perfectly round, which is really helpful. So I can now switch to the 01 pen and go in with the slightly smaller dots. You could definitely just use the 01 probably for this, but I did find it easier using the different sizes of pen. I actually didn't think I would, but I found it really very helpful, especially when I get to the really tiny ones. I found it a lot better to use the smaller nibbed pen. Obviously, it's a lot easier to use a smaller nibbed pen and go bigger than it is to try and go smaller. So I'm just adding those ones in with that one, and now I can go in with the 005 and I can add those small ones, and I can barely just touch the cardstock here and I'm still going to get a nice little dot. So just trying to figure out here exactly where I wanted them, and I did pretty much cover the pencil on the tag, but I didn't exactly cover all of the pencil on the card base, so I am going to go back in and erase those out. But just figuring out here if I'm happy. I probably could have done with a few extra sort of random ones. I think that that would have been a bit more random and made a bit more sense, but I didn't want to add too much onto this. So I can just finish off with that last little one there on the tag. And I do want to make sure that I set these aside to dry for a couple of minutes because it is that pigment ink. And now I can go in with my small eraser here. I've got one that's kind of like a pencil, which is really helpful. And I can just make sure that I'm erasing all of those pencil marks. And I think it looks really pretty with the faux splatter. Like I said, I could definitely have done this with some paint, but it is more controlled doing it this way, and I've got them exactly where I want them to be. So that is the card finished for today. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar on YouTube and also over on the Altenew blog. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Wait, we have more where that came from. If you're after fabulous card making tutorials, you are definitely in the right spot. Our amazing design team create and upload fabulous video tutorials right to this YouTube channel. If you don't want to miss another amazing crafting tutorial, don't forget to subscribe and click that fun red button that you can see. Let's become paper crafting experts together.